Okay, thank you, Anthony, for joining us and for helping us to put all of this series together as well. I wonder if you could say a little bit first about yourself and also a little bit about the other theologians that we're going to hear from in the series.
Yeah, certainly, yeah. I'm Anthony Reddie. I was born in what I still call God's own city of Bradford in West Yorkshire. My parents came from the Caribbean, particularly from the island of Jamaica, so I'm part of the Windrush generation, first generation Black British born. Grew up in Bradford, West Yorkshire, and in what was, I think, the back end of being a post-industrial city. So the reason why lots of migrants came, mainly from Bangladesh, Pakistan and India and the Caribbean, was to work in factories, mainly in sort of heavy engineering and woolen factories in the 50s and 60s, part of the sort of post-World War II reconstruction, really. And was, at that point, the city was on its sort of downward spiral in terms of Thatcherism. First, a lot of racism going there. I went to a last secondary school. I have to say it was more like a zoo than a school. About 2,000 pupils, of whom I would probably say about 99% of them did not want to be there. I was in that small minority of being a very bookish swot. And so I quite liked school, but most of my peers did not. And then from there, Birmingham University. And then I sort of got into Black liberation theology really post-university when I was a youth and community worker in Birmingham. And actually, I did not intend to become an academic. It was just a very pragmatic thing. I was doing youth and community work and did not have any tools whatsoever. So to help me in the work, working mainly with African Caribbean children and young people and their families. So I went to West Hill College at the time to do a course in youth and community work and found it very Eurocentric. Mm-hmm. And then having seemingly looking back, I still remember the day, it was the 19th of August, 1992, and had a conversation with Robert Beckford, who was then the tutor in Black Theology at Queen's, now back at Queen's, interestingly enough. And in that conversation, I was just railing at how Eurocentric this was, and were there any books out there that looked at Christian youth work from a Black Caribbean perspective. And he said, no, there isn't, you should write one. Mm. And my thought was, well, I've never written anything in my life. How do you mean write one? He says, well, you probably need to do some postgraduate study in order to get the authority to write. If you just write it, no one will believe you. But if you do it through the lens of getting an academic qualification, have you thought about doing postgraduate studies at Birmingham? And I had never thought about doing that. I mean, I got a very modest 2-2. I could tell you it was about racism and the teachers marked me. That's nonsense. I was just a lazy git, basically. I spent more time in the pub than I did in the library. I did not work hard. Got a very undistinguished 2-2 and swore blind I would never go back and study again.
I think we have something in common there then. I was also very lazy when I was at university as a young one.
Yeah, so I mean, so I was very unmotivated as an undergraduate student, so did not imagine coming back. So when I did in my early 30s, it was just a very different thing. I was passionate. I had a bit of life experience, and I knew what I was studying, and I knew why I was doing it. And as they say, like the rest, as they say, is history. In terms of the people I kind of encouraged to invite back, well, I suggest that you invited them, in all fairness. So Dwight Hopkins, I think probably with the death of James Cone, I would probably say Dwight Hopkins is the greatest Black liberation theologian living now. For many years was probably seen as James Cone's heir apparent, which I think is probably unfair on him, because I don't think that's a title really anyone should have to carry. But Hopkins did his PhD with James Cone at Union Theological Seminary. And his initial PhD was looking at the movements of Black theology in America amongst African Americans and amongst and in South Africa against apartheid. And so that was in the late 80s. And he has written numerous books and articles looking at Black theology. I think his specialism is really looking at what the cultural resources on which African Americans have drawn in order to do their Black theological work in the US.
So we're very lucky to have him joining us then.
Absolutely so, yes. I mean, I suppose I've been brought up not to do hero worship, but I guess he's probably one of the few people I would genuinely be in awe of in terms of being in the room. He's a very engaging speaker, very, very funny, very humble, but seriously clever. So Dwight Hopkins. Evie Vernon is a close friend of mine. She's from the island of Jamaica, so she comes from the same island as my parents. She is an Anglican deacon, I believe. She was never priested in Jamaica, and I still don't think she's a priest now, although that might be a question to ask her, I don't know. Evie is significant in that I think, along with Marjorie Lewis, who is a URC woman who was in Britain for a number of years doing racial justice work, they are the architects of what they would call is nannyish theology. So nannyish theology is the Jamaican version of womanist theology. So essentially, womanist theology emerges in America as a response to Black theology, which is anti-racist but still patriarchal and sexist. And so in some regards, womanist theology is a blending of feminist theology, which is critiques patriarchy, but often through the lens of white women still racist, and Black theology, which is anti-racist, but still patriarchal and sexist. So so women's theology is very much a mixture of feminism and Black liberation theology. But then in the late 90s, early 2000s, I think women in Jamaica began to say, well, we identify with what the African American women are doing, but we are not African American. We are Caribbean, and particularly we are Jamaican. And so Nanny of the Maroons is one of the 6 national heroes in Jamaica. She's the only woman who's a national hero of Jamaica. And so she was a leader of the Maroons, which was a breakaway group of freed enslaved people who lived in the hills of Jamaica and fought a long-lasting guerrilla war against the British. And Nanny was a woman leader, which was uncommon at the time. So she was a leader of this group of renegades who were fighting against British slavery. And there's a whole set of mythologies and folklore around her leadership. So I guess in simplistic terms, like she's like a Jamaican version of sort of Bodicea, kind of, a strong woman leader. And so Evie would describe herself as being a nannyish theologian.
So nannyish, and nanny is like the kind of West Midlands word for nana, grandma, nanny.
Indeed, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And then it's spelled the same, and then ish, yeah.
Yeah.
Indeed, I have to ask her about that then when she comes on.
Absolutely, yeah. And that is, it's interesting. As I said, it's very similar to womanist theology. It has lots of features of feminist theology as well, and feminism, but it's a distinctly sort of Jamaican product, really. Yeah, so
but she now lives here, doesn't she? She's in the UK now.
Yes, she did, yeah. So she did work for US, she worked for Queen's, she worked at Queen's for a number of years, so we were colleagues at Queen's. Then when she left Queen's, she then worked for USPG, and then until quite recently, I think that she now works for the Catholic Bishops sort of conference in terms of HIV and AIDS activism, really. Yeah, so British citizen now. Fundiswa Koba is, I would probably say, and I think maybe many of her peers would say, is probably the up-and-coming feminist, womanist scholar in South Africa. She's a colleague of mine, so I have this role. I have this role with the University of South Africa, and she also works at the University of South Africa. We met briefly in the Netherlands back in 2015. 2017. That's it. 2017 at a conference looking at constructive theology in the Netherlands, and we met through a Council for World Mission event. So she is a Presbyterian minister, got a PhD a couple of years ago, and at the moment she's co-editing a book to which I'm contributing in honour of a guy called Vuyami Velem, who was probably one of the leading Black theologians who died sadly of prostate cancer last year. If he hadn't have died, he probably would have been one of the people I would have invited. In addition to fundings for. She is her area is kind of mission. And she's done a lot of very, very important work in terms of critiquing the church in South Africa for its patriarchy post-apartheid. So, so she would be called one of the born frees. So she's kind of late 20s, and so she was probably born after, well, probably not actually. My maths is not quite on, so maybe she's not quite a born free, but she certainly has grown up during independence. Yeah, she's certainly grown up during independence, let's put it that way. And I think so a lot of her work is about mission of the church post-apartheid, what's its role, what's its future, and how does it rid itself of patriarchy and sexism. And then finally, William Acker is a friend and colleague in the UK. William is significant because although he's British born like myself, his parents are Ghanaian. And historically, it's still the case that a lot of the work that we define as being Black theology in Britain will be done by people of Caribbean descent. So he's one of those who straddles that. And so he certainly became, well, I became aware of him really through an article he did in the Black Theology Journal I edit, where he began to look at the relationship between colonialism and slavery as being two sides of the same coin, so not hugely different as they had often been, and he sort of tried to find a link between African theology that is done on the continent north of the Limpopo River, that's like sort of north of South Africa and Zimbabwe, where it has tended to be that white people were not in the majority in those countries, and so rather than having forms of apartheid, it was like more colonialism. And therefore what developed therefore was more African theology that was about cultural retention rather than sort of political liberation. And so in Britain, we've sort of still had that divide between those who came out of the Windrush generation, like my parents, whose raison d'etre was very much about fighting racism, and then those from African descent who came maybe a generation later, where the fight wasn't quite the same. And so therefore, even now, Black theology, as I said, is largely a Caribbean expression in Britain, with the exception perhaps of William Acker and a couple others. So I think these are very interesting sort of disparate voices that will give a range of views around Black theology and women's theology. So we all have a lot in common, but we don't exactly say the same things.
No, and it shows actually that it's very diverse.
Indeed, absolutely.
Even just from this conversation with you, you know, and you going through those people, I mean, you know, that's what I've kind of picked up, is actually it's not at all a kind of monochrome thing, Black theology.
No.
And I mean, one question we might want to ask the women that are coming on might be that, do they find it kind of a bit patriarchal to be actually put under the banner of Black theology, if that is, you know, it's not womanist theology, is it?
Yeah. Indeed, yeah, and that is still an ongoing conversation, actually. You know,
it should be called Black and Womanist theology or something. I don't know.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of conversation as to why that hasn't been done. I suspect it's a mixture of laziness and patriarchy. Yeah, indeed. That's a good question to ask.
This ongoing question of kind of default male, isn't it? And the kind of default word will be the male word, and then they'll kind of branch out into feminine versions of it. Or,
indeed, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, I've got another question for you, Anthony. So
yeah, sure.
It's something we've discussed in the past, which is I think probably on social media, which is that you say that you think that theology done from the perspective of race, which is not inclusive, for example, of LGBT people, is not really what you would term Black theology. Can you kind of maybe develop on that a bit more?
Indeed, oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so firstly, I think one has to differentiate between Black people who do theology and Black theologians. The Black theology is an ideological perspective. So I guess the parallel would be that not all women doing theology would necessarily be feminist theologians. Yeah. So firstly, it's an ideological framing. That said, therefore, what is a major part of that ideological framing is the issue of liberation, and liberation from various norms. So what all the theologians of liberation have in common is that they are fighting against established norms. So whether it's feminist theology, it's fighting against patriarchy as the norm. And as like you just said previously, that basically it tends to be male-centric, and then at a push, as a secondary move, we then think about women. Well, and similarly in terms of like classic liberation theology, then like the norm would be, I think, sort of middle-class bourgeois experiences from which the poor are then trying to reform that normative position. Well, in terms of Black theology, it's about race and whiteness. So race and whiteness is a norm. Black theology is trying to reform that. That's its ideological position. Mm-hmm. But the reason why I think the importance of affirming LGBTQI plus experiences are important is because as a theology of liberation, all of them are linked in this sense of trying to stand beside people on the margins who are marginalized for a whole variety of similar reasons around power, and critiquing and transforming that norm. Therefore, if you look at the method starts with human experience, starts with what's your reality of your oppression, then using that as a point of departure, then asking the question, well, how then does that experience then help you to reread the normative Christian position in terms of the doctrines and in terms of sacred text, in this particular case, normally like the Bible. So you're rereading it and critiquing it in light of human experience. Well, Black people have learned to do that, particularly others who come from diaspora backgrounds, because we know that embedded in the text is issues of empire, and certainly the way in which the Christian faith always was invariably colluding with social norms, particularly around slavery. So although slavery in the scriptures is not the same as chattel slavery, the fact is that those texts we use as justification. So Colossians 3:22, or Ephesians 6:5, where it talks about slaves obey your masters. Well, enslaved people reread that, critiqued it, challenged it, dispensed with it, and said, actually, we will not be conditioned by how the scriptures used in the normative power situation marginalizes us. Well, obviously, LGBT people then do exactly the same in terms of the texts that are trying to other them, in terms of Leviticus and various other places and the stuff that Paul writes. It's a similar theological method. It's not the same issue, but they have similar roots in terms of critique and challenging power. Therefore, when Black people say, well, actually, like we're rereading the text and we're challenging the ways in which racism is read into it, but, however, we want to use the text in order to still continue to other LGBT people, that clearly is an inconsistency that can't work if you're claiming to be on the side of liberation. Because either all of us who are marginalized are deserving of full respect and humanity and inclusion, or else none of us are.
Yeah.
You can't pick and choose the bits you want. You can't say, well, actually, I'm really against racism, but the scriptures say that people have to be heterosexual. Because, well, actually, those still scriptures are the ones that are still othering people on the grounds of race. So for me, an authentic Black theology has to be one that is committed to intersectionality. So it's committed to critiquing patriarchy. So, so obviously, if slaves should not obey their masters, then then wives then should not be submissive to their husbands, and people who are in same gender loving relationships therefore should not be condemned either, because all those things are critiqued by human experience. I say that because, and for me that's important, because I think there's always been a tension within Black theology in Britain that goes right back to a German Lutheran woman called Roswitha Gerloff. So she did her PhD at Birmingham University in the late 80s, and she worked for an organization that was then called the Centre for Black and White Christian Partnership, which was part of the Selliot Colleges at Birmingham University. And in that work, it was very much about sort of trying to get Pentecostal churches who were then way on the margins, not part of the mainstream, into part of the kind of ecumenical conversations around being church in Britain, and also encouraging Pentecostal pastors then to undertake theological work. And so her thesis was a plea for Black British theologies. And therefore, it was assumed that therefore what she was developing was a prototypical Black liberation theology. I don't think she was doing that. I think what she was developing was a model of Black people doing theology, predominantly through a Pentecostal lens. I mean, that work is important work, and I affirm it, but it's not Black liberation work. And so I think there's always been this slippage because of that, of that historical antecedents for some Pentecostals to assume that what they are doing is Black theology. Now, actually, what they're doing can be Black theology if it's prepared to critique and challenge the existing social norms. So early Robert Beckford work is, I think, a version of Black theology. More modern Pentecostal work, I don't think is. And so one of my books, I think it's Working Against the Grain, that came out in 2008, I differentiate between Black, how does it go? There's like a three-part thing. So the first part are those Black Christians who are colorblind. So they want to say that we don't see color, we want to be universal, we just want to be like everyone else. They tend to be fairly evangelical, maybe fundamentalist, and they don't see color. The second category is what I call Black Christian experience, which is Black people who will see difference, will affirm cultural identity within African Caribbean cultures, but are not doing liberative work in terms of trying to challenge the tradition and reread it in light of human experience. The third category is Black liberation theology, which has to affirm all people are marginalized, including LGBT plus individuals, because it recognizes how power operates and that we have a great deal in common in terms of how we are othered.
Yeah, and that's basically the work of inclusive church as well, isn't it? That's intersectional. To recognise, as one of our trustees says, that all exclusion or all discrimination is the same exclusion, discrimination.
Yeah.
And therefore, all the different liberation theologies, if you want to call them that, queer theology, Black theology, feminist theology, womanist theology, are all kind of siblings, really, of each other. And so that's how you would see in Black theology and why it can't be anti-LGBT, basically, because it's a theology of liberation.
Absolutely.
Which extends to all people. And there are, of course, Black LGBT people as well, within.
Of course.
They don't have a name for Black LGBT theology, I don't think, like you have Black feminist theology. But...
Not yet, although there is, there's been some interesting developments in that. So it still tends to be an area that's underdeveloped, I think, within Black and womanist theology. So although most authentic Black and womanist theologians would be fully affirming, there's only a handful of texts that have been written from that perspective, and thus far I'm not aware that they've come up with a specific naming category for what they are doing. I would have no problems, obviously, if they did, because I think there's something about naming your specific experience and giving it a particular category that helps in terms of definition. Part of the challenge, of course, is in how all these different perspectives then still work together, because at their worst, what you end up is different groups in their silos, thinking that their particular form of exclusion is worse than someone else's, or is superior to someone else's, or should be the point of default, which I think is not helpful.
And we are all sometimes guilty of falling into that, aren't we? And that's,
yeah,
that's the challenge, isn't it? To keep on saying to ourselves, actually, am I just focusing on my own pain and on my own exclusion, or should I be thinking about this very specific exclusion someone else feels, and which is actually in some cases worse than mine, or in some cases, you know,
indeed, yeah,
more relevant, you know, like, for example, at this very moment, you know, with the Black Lives Matter, which I unfortunately put as Black Lives Matters in my latest newsletter, and my wife picked it up and she was like, "Oh, Ruth, you look a bit silly there." But yeah, just, you know, to focus on that, it's important to focus on that and not kind of go, oh, but also LGBT, because it's just not the right moment. And I feel like that's something we have to be really careful about, actually.
Yeah.
Okay. I was going to say just one comment on what you've been saying, actually, and
sure.
That was when you were talking about slavery in the Bible and how Black people interpreted that, and kind of reinterpreted and reread those passages, and how LGBT people are doing the same thing. And I think that's really interesting, because a lot of the books and the things I've read about LGBT theology, you know, being gay myself, often they kind of use the way that Christians defended slavery from the Bible as a reason to say, actually, we should kind of question the way that anti-LGBT theology is continuing in the church, because actually maybe that's not a good way of interpreting our Christian story in the bigger picture. Great. Okay. So the next question is, in your opinion, what does Black theology include Asian theologies? Because of course they exist as well, and also the theology of other ethnic groups. I don't know, perhaps native or indigenous groups. And what are the similarities and differences, do you think?
Indeed, yeah. Well, I mean, I think what has always made Black theology in Britain quite distinct in that regard is that unlike, let's say, in North America or in South Africa, maybe it's similar to the Caribbean in some regards, that Black is being used as much as a political designation as it is in terms of an ethnic and cultural one. So although it tends to be overwhelmingly people of African descent through a Caribbean lens, through one's immediate forebears, like my, so in my case, my ancestors are from Africa, but my immediate parents and family is from the Caribbean. That tends to be the bulk of people who are doing Black theology in Britain. It's always been as much a political movement, and that really comes out of the 1970s sort of anti-racist alliance work. And within that, Black was a political designation really for anyone who just wasn't white. And part of that really was our shared experience that actually when the racists were trying to other us, like they didn't really differentiate between which island you came from in the Caribbean, and they certainly didn't differentiate if your parents were born in Jamaica or if they were born in Bangalore. The fact is, like, you were not white, and the National Front certainly didn't make any differentiations between them either. And so certainly when I was growing up at this large school / zoo, my best friends came from every ethnic group, and certainly I had lots of friends who were from India. Well, a lot of parents were from India and Pakistan. We were all Blackthornians in one sense. And so at one level, there's always been that inclusive element within it. So within Black theology in Britain, you would have the likes of Michael Jagger, who is Indo-Caribbean. So he's born in Guyana. He's also quick to tell me it's not a Caribbean island, it's on the mainland.
South America.
On South America. Yeah, but it's always been classed as part of the Caribbean because it's an English-speaking enclave. So therefore it's part of the Caribbean. But as you always want to tell me, actually, we are not an island. We're part of the continent. Yeah, whatever, Michael. But anyway, but even so, if you saw him, his ancestors were indentured servants taken from India to the Caribbean Actually, so when slavery ended, they still needed cheap labour, so they just imported it from India. And effectively what he always says, which I would agree, is that indentured work was just modified slavery.
Yeah.
So Michael Jagside would be counted. Very close friend of mine is Reverend Dr. Indrajit Bogle, former president of the Methodist Conference. He born in Kenya of Indian parentage and came to Britain in the late 60s when the nationalists in Kenya began to turn against the Indian population. So he came with his Sikh family. And he's always been part of Black Theology in Britain. Similar, someone like Mukti Barton, who I used to work with at Queen's, would also be part of Black Theology in Britain, although she would always call it Black and Asian theology, which again is fine. But I think as in a lot of kind of identity-based theologies, it's about self-identification. So I think for those three people, and maybe there are a couple of others as well, that they would identify themselves as being part of the political struggle in terms of anti-racism, and therefore be part of Black Theology in Britain. Conversely, there are others, friends of theirs and friends of mine, who would say, well, that's just too broad brush. What that doesn't take into account are the specificities about being Asian that are not necessarily the same as being Black African. And therefore, for other people, they would want to talk specifically about Asian theologies. I would see those again as being partners and being part of a broader family, in this case, that what would be called like contextual theology. The theologies that come out of a particular context. The only critique I would make of that is that all liberation theologies are contextual, but not all contextual theologies are liberative. So, for example, Indian theology can be liberationist in one sense in terms of being anti-colonial, certainly coming out of a critique of whiteness in the British Empire. But at the same time, it has often been developed through high caste Brahmin experiences that then can marginalize Dalits or people seen as untouchables. Therefore, I'm always slightly wary when someone says I'm into Asian theology. My issue would be, well, what kind of Asian theology are you into? In the same way that I have friends who will say, well, I'm not into Black theology, I'm into African theology. And I would say, okay, but African theology can still be oppressive to women in terms of patriarchy, in terms of affirming some cultural practices like female sort of genital mutilation, for example, which is quintessentially African tradition, but it's oppressive.
Yeah.
Therefore, as I said, all theologies are contextual anyway, but obviously all liberation theologies they come out of a specific experience and context, but not all contextual theologies are necessarily liberationist. So I think that would be the only query I would make about Black theology being in partnership with other theologies that come from specific cultural or ethnic experiences that give rise to them being called contextual. But I tend to be fairly fluid about this because I think it's about how people name themselves. So for example, if I'm working with an Asian colleague, so there's a woman I've just become I've become aware of quite recently, a woman called Dr. Sanji Pereira. And she's done quite a lot with the Church of England, looking at racism in the Church of England. She's Sri Lankan. And she often says, well, I think I'm Black in terms of my identification with critiquing racism in the Church of England. Can I be part of the Black Theology in Britain movement? And I say, yeah, of course you can. If your work identifies with critiquing normative position of power, and certainly she's also someone who would see her work as also being about kind of as a queer theology. I mean that it's critiquing and challenging sort of some of the binaries around sort of heteronormativity versus that which is other. And she would say that, well, actually, part of what she's doing within her work is also recognizing that there are a lot of people who are othered on the basis of race are also othered on the basis of their sexuality as well. So I can think of at least 2 high-profile Methodists who have been oppressed because of their sexuality by other Black people, largely of African descent, in some of our churches. And her work supports them. So I would happily see her part of the movement, but I wouldn't impose that upon anyone.
That must be a lot of fun, not to be oppressed from 2 angles like that.
Oh, it's absolutely, yeah. And that then goes back to the point I made in the previous question about how these things are often interlinked.
Definitely. And I wonder, going back to the question of the differences maybe between, if there are any differences between Asian and Black theology, but also between different Black theologies, because you talked about how, is it William Aka, who's of Ghanaian descent, and I wonder if there's something, there's a kind of specificity and importance to the experience in your ancestry of slavery. I don't know if that is something that makes Black theology a bit different from Asian theology, and even some Black theologies, maybe they would William Aka see that as part of his story, or would, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'm hesitant to speak for William, so I think probably ask William the question. I think, but I think one of the things he has certainly said in one of the essays he's written is that sense of if your family comes from the continent and they come from a country where there is still existing historical languages, because obviously colonialism didn't take away people's languages, but obviously slavery did. So Aka is an African name, but Reddie, R-E-D-D-I-E, is ironically a Scottish name. And I've got a Scottish name because the Highland clearances of 1745, when the Scots under Boniface Charlotte obviously sort of lost their attempt like to regain the British throne, that many were deported to the Caribbean, and many went to Jamaica and became slave owners. So, so there are differences, but I think what I have to say about theologies of liberation is that we are more alike than unalike. So there's more that binds us in terms of the frameworks that exclude us. But obviously there are specificities within that, which is why I have no problems with some of the sort of niching of how theology is developed, just so long as we are clear that in that niche we are still committed to the empowerment and liberation of all people.
And although maybe people whose ancestors weren't exactly slaves are doing liberation theology, it doesn't mean that they haven't got a historical ancestral experience of a violence of colonization, which is still a violence. I mean, look at what happened to indigenous people in North America, and that's absolutely a terrible violence as well. And yet they weren't taken as slaves, but it's still
indeed,
so
indeed, absolutely.
So more in common. Okay, so the next question is, if you could suggest 1 or 2 of your books to our supporters, we're going to plug them now.
Yeah, sure.
Which ones do you think they should start with?
I would say 1 of 2 books. It depends upon where people are in terms of where they're starting, I guess, because I guess all of us don't start at the same places. If one is interested in Black theology from a more academic perspective, then I would probably say the core text I did with SCM. So SCM core text, Black theology after one with Martin Luther King on the front. That explains how Black theology functions as an academic discipline, and also it's not just the what of Black theology, it's also the why. So why is it different? Because one of the things that makes Black theology distinct is that it wasn't thought up by academics. It was really something that emerged from the lived experience of people. And Cohen's genius, who wrote the first Black theology book, Black Theology of Black Power in 1969, was simply his attempt to narrate what was already happening on the streets by activists of faith who are fighting white supremacy. So it's different from other intellectual movements because it wasn't started by academics, and therefore it's always tried to operate, not always done it successfully, mind you, in terms of sort of trying to displace the rules by which academic theology works. So I would probably say, if you're interested in some of the theories of Black theology, then my SCM core textbook. Mm-hmm. Conversely, if you're more of an activist and you say, well, you know, I mean, all that theory is nice, but what I really want is stuff that will help me to preach on a Sunday, or stuff that will help me to think about how the church organizes itself in a way that is informed by the principles of Black theology, then I would probably say another of my book called Is God Colorblind? Although what I would say about that book is that if you hang on for a couple of weeks, like there's going to be a new edition coming out, because it came out in 2012. Sorry. The core textbook came out in 2012, and that was relatively successful and has continued to be so. But Is God Colorblind came out 3 years early, came out in 2009, with more of a whimper than a bang, let's put it that way. So it didn't do that well the first time around. A few people bought it, but it wasn't particularly well marketed. I think SPCK themselves would say that. I think with the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and the kind of rise in anti-racist consciousness, plus, as they say, well, you've got a much bigger profile now, Anthony, in 2020 than you did in 2009. We'd like to bring out a new edition. Can you make a few changes? I've written an afterword to it. It's coming out with a new fancy cover, apparently, end of this month. So I'll probably say, if you want a more practical-based book, then Is God Colorblind?
Mm-hmm. And how many books have you written, Anthony?
So with that new edition coming out, that will be my 19th, 19.
Wow, would you say that's prolific?
Yes, I would on the whole, although Dwight Hopkins is probably did about 30 odd, so, you know, so it's
like more than one a year probably, isn't it? Yeah.
It's all relative, I guess.
I guess so, yeah. Okay, so you mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement, and it seems to be, hopefully, changing some things for the better, and at least getting in people's, you know, consciousness, like you said. And it's starting up. I've noticed that it's starting up more of a critical conversation around race, even in mainstream places, like on Radio 4. I heard quite an interesting program the other day. And it's talking about, you know, we're talking more about the colonial past and the damage done by our colonial past, instead of just kind of yay for the UK, yay for England. So what do you hope will change in the coming years in the UK, if that's not too broad?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I think I would like to, I hope that three things would change. Well, I hope lots of things would change, but let's just maybe work with these sort of top three, really. So at a macro level, at a more systemic level, I hope that there would now be an admission. I think what COVID-19 showed us was the way in which British society has always been inequitable. It's not new, it's been like that for centuries. So actually that one can look at issues of class and say, actually, Britain has always oppressed white working class people, for example. So long before migrants came along, issues of empire and power and the collusion of Christianity with the ruling class often was one that made middle class respectability normal and then ignored poverty. So you had things like workhouses and even stuff like, you know, the deserving and the undeserving poor. So obviously, like, there's some poor people who we should help and some poor people who just not try hard enough and they deserve it and we should punish them. And it's interesting, though often sort of say sometimes in a lot of my talks, I say, it's interesting that we have the language for the undeserving poor, but we've never had the language for the undeserving rich. That somehow people with money, it's a blessing, but if you're poor, it's a curse, and a lot of times it's your fault. So I think there's always been a relationship between race and class. And therefore, I think hopefully that one of the things that might come out of this is that we might have a much more concerted effort, although clearly not if people still vote for the Conservative Party, by me. But even so, an effort to say this, that we live in an inequitable society, that in a country with the 5th biggest economy, to have food banks and austerity is a political choice. There's nothing inevitable about it. That's the choice that our government and a lot of us are colluding with in order to punish people whose experience of marginalisation is one that is about how most of us who are middle class have actually sort of colluded with that. So firstly, now that we can see it, because before it was so well hidden, or maybe another way, a lot of the mainstream society just chose not to see what was going on around them. But actually what COVID and Black Lives Matter, death of George Floyd, shows us actually is that we live in a deeply inequitable and deeply unfair world of entrenched poverty that often has a colour, although that's not exclusive to Black and Asian people, of course. So firstly, hopefully, that rising from that, then the second bit then is about empathy. Hopefully there would be a greater sense of we are our brothers and sisters' keeper. And therefore, rather than people vote on the basis of a sense of self-interest, which is how often people do vote, you know, I mean, a number of times I sat with decent, genuinely Christian-minded people who would say, well, you know, if I vote this way or if I vote for these particular policies, these will be the ones that will help people like myself. And you think, okay, I understand that, but like, you do understand that there are people whose lives are so far worse than your own who really need better resources, and your experience of hopefully being marginally better off because you vote for a particular party really should not be the way in which your faith should be encouraging you to vote. Surely that should not be uppermost in your mind. So hopefully there'll be a greater sense of empathy, because I think what always struck me, certainly in the days when I was doing my Black Theology work, was the sheer disinterest of most white people. That at best they would say, well, you know, okay, you know, Anthony, okay, so we hear what you're saying, but is it really that bad, you know? Our police don't carry guns. No, they don't carry guns. Okay, so let's be grateful for that. But actually, every Black person can tell you what it's like if you're driving a car and the police stop you and you feel guilty before you've even done anything, because like you just know that their mandate to protect and serve doesn't include you. So yes, okay, they don't carry guns, and I'm grateful for that. But I have lost count the number of times I have been stopped. You know, I mean, there's even a point now where I drive a crappy old car on purpose, because at least that way, like, you know, I mean, I don't get stopped. I mean, you know, I'm sorry. But, so I've got two brothers, and they both drive BMWs. They love cars. They despair of the crap I drive, but yeah, you know, obviously I'm much more righteous than they are, obviously. But the number of times they get stopped for absolute trivialities, and then the utter contempt with which they're spoken at. So you then train yourself, and you train your siblings, and you train your young people you work with to be humble and to be passive, because that's the way like you keep yourself out of trouble. Why the hell should we have to be passive and humble, simply going about our law-abiding existence because white police officers can't treat us with dignity? And the number of times I've tried to share that, and white respectful people will say, but surely our police don't behave like that. So
it's easier to not believe it, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So at least hopefully there'll be greater empathy. And then finally, the other third thing I hope would change is personal responsibility. So one of the great quotes I often make is where Gandhi says that, you know, that each of us has to be that which we want to. Actually, this got out of my head. What's it? Be that which you want to see in the world.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yes, sounds about right. I'm sure maybe it's not quite exactly, but even so. that most of us don't have the power to change the world. Most of us can't affect systemic change. However, we can practice empathy. And even more than that, we can be that thing that we want to see as different in the world. So one of the things I've often said, and I think I had to learn this myself, was that lots of times, given my existence in theological education and in church-related training work, it was not uncommon to be the only Black person in the room. Mm. And yet, we see racism either within the curriculum or racism in terms of practice or in terms of thinking up strategies and who's not at the table. And if I didn't raise it, it would never get raised. It would never get raised. And what I would sort of say to my white colleagues is, why is it that it's the people who are the victims who then have to do the raising? Mm. Now, what sensitized me to that were my women colleagues who said, but Anthony, why is it that we have to raise patriarchy and sexism? Why is it not men who are doing it? And I took that seriously. I thought, you know something, I shouldn't have to sit in a meeting and wait for my women colleagues to say, but wait a minute, why is it that when we are, I don't know, advocating a training policy, like we've just named 7 men, and no one notices that like it's all men? Mm-hmm. Well, actually, for me to be an ally is to say, but I notice that these are all men, and I may well be one of those men who's named. Mm-hmm. Therefore, not only do I name it, do I then critique it and say, actually, a number of us have to resign immediately from this in order that women not brought in tokenistically, they should have been there in the first place, should be a part of that. That's what being a proper ally or having empathy means. It means speaking out against your own vested interest. That's what carrying the cross means. That's what it means to love your neighbor as you love yourself, is to say, actually, so assuming that my own self-love is one where I expect to be accorded a degree of respect and recognition, then I have to practice that for the other as I would for myself. And that often means, when we talk sort of theologically about Jesus kenosis, or Jesus giving up, is that actually central to all forms of systemic change is that those people with some sense of inbuilt advantage, whether it's gender, whether it's ethnicity / race, whether it's sexuality, whether it's economics, have to give up. We have to stand back. We have to create space and let other people in. Mm. We may not be able to change the world, but we can certainly challenge the practices in which we are implicated. And that's what I hope would happen from this particular moment, that people would be much more sensitized to who is not at the table, to whose voice is not being heard, and in what ways, even in our own practice. So a number of times I've been asked to take part in events, and the first question I ask is, so who else is taking part? And if I do not think that that's an inclusive group or inclusive initiative, then I will at the very least suggest other names that should be added. If that doesn't change, then I will drop out. And I will drop out and I will tell them why I'm dropping out. And hopefully, if they want me enough to be involved with it, then they'll take seriously out the suggestions I made that other people should join. Now, that shouldn't need to happen. Hopefully, what should happen is that people organising it should be aware of those things. But at the very least, insofar as what little power I have, given the fact that they've invited me, at the very least I can ask the question and be critical in my perspective around that sense of inclusion.
Yeah. And actually, there's more to it than just kind of looking good, isn't there? I think a lot of people think diversity and inclusion is about kind of looking good in your I don't know, your charity trustees board or your workplace, and having the right number of Black people and women and stuff. It's not about that. It's about the fact that if you don't have a diverse board or a diverse group of people in your workplace, you're not getting all the experiences of the world. You know, you're not hearing everything that we need to hear to grow and to be better people, and actually to be a better workplace. You know, and
indeed, absolutely.
The value that it is, you know, that's what it's about, isn't it?
It is.
in the end.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's why it's not about tokenism, isn't it?
No.
So yes, I think as much as it would be nice to kind of say, oh, you know, we've got a diverse board at Inclusive Church, actually, I think that's a long process. I think part of it is actually just also thinking more about what we need to do that's more broad and what's more diverse in terms of the work we're doing. So
yeah,
and that's almost more important, you know, than kind of token people. Although it would be great to have a very, very diverse board, wouldn't it be great everywhere to have a diverse? Yeah. So the next one is, if we were to run another series after this one related to our work strand on ethnicity, what do you think it should be?
So what's on ethnicity? I think something, well, either something around intersectionality. So I've journeyed with two very, very close friends who are Black and gay. One, as I said, is Methodist, who's now just become Anglican, and another is Pentecostal. And I think what I've seen from their experiences is that they have they're a sort of liminal kind of position, a sort of in-between position, a position of tension, in that whilst I think it would be a caricature to say that all Black communities are homophobic, they're not by any means. But I think it's true to say that the internalization of mission Christianity, that's Christianity that came through English missions and that was propagated faith in the Caribbean and across Africa through colonialism, is one that helped to reinforce notions of heteronormativity and homophobia. You know, it's important to remind ourselves of all the laws that have been passed in many of those countries laterally were passed by the British and the Victorians. They were not passed by the Africans and the native people themselves. Therefore, part of what shaped that sense of what I often call sort of respectability culture is that when you are marginalized for a particular identity, in this case, let's say race and ethnicity, there's always that temptation to say that in order to become acceptable, we need to become more respectable. And therefore, anything that looks like it might bring shame upon the community or some type of notoriety is a kind of thing that we need to shun in order to show the establishment, however you understand it, that we are worthy of more respect. And that's always a fool's errand. It's always a fool's errand because there's no evidence anywhere that any group that were marginalized, that their attempt to become more respectable really gained them significant advantages and significant progress. It never does, but all it does is it then just means that the people in that particular group, however the group's defined, if they're not seen to play by the rules, and the group itself then shuns them. And that then just ends up then actually sort of weakening the group, because what you end up then doing is become so obsessed with respectability politics. So, for example, even in the early days when George Floyd died, you still had some Black people sort of saying, "Oh yeah, but I mean, like, he wasn't a very, very sort of respectable person. Oh yeah, so therefore that meant that like his dying somehow actually was somehow less tragic because he wasn't a role model." I mean, that's just nonsense, you know. All that to say that I think one of the issues that certainly as a Black theologian I'm committed to is the creation of better allyship for those people who are whose sexuality is not framed within a heteronormative binary, I guess, framework. And to help them to navigate that, because certainly I had There's one of my friends, he for a while went to the Metropolitan Church and said, well, it was okay, but of course, it was still very white, still very racist. So I did stay there. And I said, okay, so where do you go next? He says, well, I went to another church. And to be honest with you, I think he is now reluctant to come to the view that maybe he just has to create his own church. Or maybe join an inclusive church and find a way of creating another type of church, you know, because it seems that a lot of the existing ecclesial frameworks don't sit easy with people who are in that kind of intersection or that kind of sort of liminal space. So something that looks at people who kind of cross boundaries or borders is, I think, something quite significant, because actually what we all know is that that most of us actually don't live some type of hermetically, ideologically pure life, you know, that all our lives are varied and we have different impulses, and actually depending upon the context we are in, like we could name ourselves in different ways. And therefore, how then do we help people then to navigate that, where you don't necessarily want to place yourself in a particular group? So, for example, in my own family and within extended friendship networks, you've got couples who come from different ethnic and cultural groups. In the old days, the children would be called half-caste, which is a racist term, so obviously that we don't use it anymore. And therefore, whether it's shared heritage or whatever term you're using, what many of their children, that's my own niece, that how they would navigate their identity across different ethnic and cultural lines is different from myself growing up within a Jamaican household where both my parents came from Jamaica and all my siblings were all, you know, so myself and my siblings, you know, like we're all born within 6 years of each other. We have lots of shared identities. That is no longer the automatic norm anymore. Mm. So therefore, how then do we take into consideration all types of intersectionalities and taking those niches seriously, but still being committed to a broader coalition work that is trying to fight for justice and for dignity for all people?
Mm-hmm. So something on intersectionality would be good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Okay, I'm going to ask a few questions from supporters now, because I put out a word on Facebook and Twitter, and we've had a few back. So we've got one from someone called Ruth, who's not me, and that is, what would you most like to tell inclusive church supporters and churches?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would actually go back to that thing about intersectionality again, because I think one of the things that sometimes happens, well, that's what happens, it happens a lot and too often, mm-hmm. is that if we imagine the way in which we think about these intersectionalities as a series of sort of linked boxes, you know, and each box has its little, you know, so this is a box marked race, and this is the box marked disability, and the box marked sexuality, and the box marked cultural identity, and the box marked class, and you know, and all that kind of stuff. What tends to happen is that the minute you move away from the box marked race, all the others take on the assumption of whiteness. So, for example, as you said earlier, in passing, but it's fundamentally true, and obviously I've just shared that in terms of a couple of my friends. The LGBT experiences come in many different guises, in many different classes, many different ethnicities. Therefore, there are Black people in those groups as much as there are white middle class people, white working class people, etc., etc., etc. What tends to happen is that the minute you move away from an analysis around race, it then assumes this kind of whiteness. I remember having a conversation with a friend, well, he was on Facebook, it was someone I knew, but eventually we kind of fell out because all my attempts to remind him that he was speaking in a very essentialist way about sexuality was not particularly helpful. So I was talking about being on a plane, coming back from America and being like the only black person in the lounge of all us Brits. So all of us have gone to a conference in American Academy of Religion. We're all coming back, and obviously that there's only so many flights that are coming back to Britain. So all the Brits ended up in a particular departure lounge, flying back to the UK, and I was the only black person. So this guy sort of said, well, you know, he was white, and said, well, imagine if like you were the only gay person. I said, well, that's true. But unless like you wore a sign that said, oh, hello, I am gay,
Yes.
no one would immediately guess that within a party of all white people. So yes, I accept that, but that's not the same thing, because like you're assuming that your whiteness has nothing to do with your sexuality, when of course it does. And for some reason, he just seemed unable to get that conversation into his head. So in the end, you know, I mean, I sort of defended him because I was got sick of he's like trying to conflate the two things when they are linked. Of course they are, but of course, here's the thing: him being a white gay man, he's still a damn sight better off than like my two black friends who are gay. They're not automatically the same, even though everything I said before I still stand by in terms of we're more alike than unalike. Mm. Therefore, I think one of the criticisms I would make of the inclusive church, although in fairness, actually one can make it in terms of lots of organisations. So let me not, you know, pick on the inclusive church any more than I pick on the Methodist Church as a whole, or the Church of England, or the college where I work in Oxford. You know, so their college started in January, like the men meet at home and they're very friendly, but I'm still like the only black member of staff. Mm. Is yes, let's take intersectionality seriously, but let's also realise the fact that even amongst that, there are still some overarching frameworks that are controlling our narrative, and whiteness is one of them.
Yeah. I would agree with that fully. I think, you know, it's just as important to recognise the differences between all the different exclusionary kind of traits and whatever you want to call them, as well as the intersectional. Intersectionality is really important. Understanding that all exclusion is the same, exclusion is the same, but there's also the kind of, actually some people have this privilege for this, other people have privilege there. You know, yeah. I would accept that we have invisibility privilege quite often. And I would even accept that I have more invisibility privilege than a butch woman, for example. You know, yeah. Like a more butch lesbian. Yeah. And so, you know, the more visible you are, and so somebody that's a different race is more visible. So of course, you know, you feel more uncomfortable in a situation like you were in than someone who was kind of not visibly gay. Yeah. Okay, and the next one is from someone called Rosemary on Facebook. She says, in the Western world, Jesus has most often been represented as a white man, which is not historically accurate, although some people might think it is. When it comes to the images we have of God and Jesus, both physical representations and the representations we have in our own minds, the images, how much do you think it matters what they look like and why?
Yeah, I mean, it matters, I think, for a whole variety of reasons. I mean, let me just sort of think of two, because obviously, you know, I mean, people write whole PhDs on this stuff, and I've written about it in lots of ways in a number of my books. So two things, really. Firstly, that I think, obviously, within Christianity, obviously, there was a prohibition within Judaism of no graven images of God. Fine. And Christianity kind of held to that, certainly for the first sort of 2 or 3 centuries or so. Then, of course, what they then realised, well, of course, if Jesus is fully human and fully God, then the fully human bit, we probably can make images of him, because that's not the God bit, that's the human bit. And therefore it matters, because how Jesus is depicted is how we are, therefore, in our humanity, in which images and symbols are significant, are imagining God's self. Therefore, that sense of representation of what the divine looks like is important because of the way in which that then gestures to what kind of God that we're worshipping. Therefore, it's no accident that Jesus became white, because a white Jesus was used, therefore, that to reinforce empire. It was used to reinforce white supremacy. That's not accidental. I think one of the tensions is that, of course, what we say in our Orthodox Christian theology is that the risen Christ is where two or three are gathered. Therefore, the risen Christ is not limited to a particular identity in terms of being a Palestinian Jew. It's not that anymore. That Jews can take on the fashion wherever two or three are gathered. Therefore, a white contextual Jesus for a white predominant nation in and of itself is not a bad thing. The problem is when that symbol then becomes a de facto normative one that relegates all others to a position of non-existence, because our assumption is that Jesus has to be white. That's where it becomes deeply problematic. But of course, the other reason why it matters is its impact upon human beings and their ability then to identify with God. I still remember, and I told the story in lots of other places, that when I was 11 years old, growing up in Eastbrook Hall in Bradford, I moved from the juniors to the intermediates, as they were called, Sunday school, before moving into the senior group. And in the intermediate group, like, we met at this parlour at the back of the church, big, cold, drafty room, with a picture of Jesus who looked more like Bjorn Borg than Bjorn Borg looks like Bjorn Borg. And that, for me, created a real existential crisis at the time, because in the church in which we were taught all the usual rubrics of the faith, and one was obviously that all of us are created in the image and likeness of God, and Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God. Then begs the question, so who am I then? And I remember asking my Sunday school teacher that question at age 11, but miss, if that is Jesus, Jesus is the Son of God, and we're creating the image and likeness of God, then who am I? And she said, oh, I don't know, it doesn't matter. Now, at one level, it not mattering is a certain truth, because obviously that our faith, although it's embedded in culture and identity, also transcends it. So people have often speculated, or quite frankly, why you'd speculate about this kind of stuff, I don't know, about what our identity will look like in heaven. I mean, seriously, I mean, that's really the thing that you want to get worried about, like with all the injustice that is in front of us here on earth. I mean, but even so, people have often said, well, you're trying to speculate around what our identity would be like in heaven once, like, we've passed through this mortal coil. And on the whole, the consensus is that actually that those things would disappear. That somehow, that somehow we probably may not be embodied, but our differences would be subsumed into a unified identity. Don't know, don't care, quite frankly. But, however, that's not the reality where we are now. Our differences are significant. That actually one of the things that COVID has shown us is that actually your life expectancy is linked to your postcode, and your postcode is often linked to what ethnicity and what cultural group or class group you're in, as to whether or not you will survive COVID-19 or not. We know across the world that, like, your life expectancy, if you're someone of colour in the global south, will be significantly less than if you're a white middle class person in the global north. These things therefore matter. Therefore, what Jesus looks like and how you identify with him absolutely matters. That's why in Black theology, one of the key things that that early generation came up with this notion of the Black Christ. They were not arguing that Jesus was literally black. They were not arguing, although there is a small niche element of Black theology that has worked within the context of Black nationalism. But that has always been a niche group. Most black theologians have never argued for Jesus being black on the grounds of phenotypes, on the grounds of ethnicity. We've argued it on the grounds of Jesus' identification with Black suffering. So therefore, wherever people are suffering and where other people are marginalized, their Christ is in the midst as one of them, sharing their suffering, but also empowering them to resist their suffering and to fight for liberation. Therefore, a key thing about the Black Christ is also therefore like the critique of the white Christ. So what a lot of white people sometimes found difficult when you read Eddie Cohn, and Cohn says, well, you know, we need to kill a white Jesus. And people will say, oh my God, you know, I mean, that's, or another person he talks about the white Jesus being the Antichrist. Is because what he's saying is that this is symbol of whiteness that is often the symbol of death. It's a symbol of power that can brutally snuff out other people's realities. Think of a police officer who puts his knee on someone's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and that person is saying, I can't breathe, and it doesn't give a damn. And they continue doing it, and they're smiling, and they're doing it, and this person says, but I can't breathe, and it still happens. Tell me how whiteness, therefore, is not a symbol of death. Tell me how that when I was growing up, if you saw the police, you just ran in the other direction, and you put a much distance between you and them because nothing good ever came from your encounter with them. Therefore, a critique of whiteness is not to damn every white person, but it's to say, actually, let's just be honest with you. Across the bulk of history of the world, whiteness has meant for many people death, at best second-class citizenship, and at worst, certainly in terms of colonialism, being rendered a lesser being in your own land in ways that white people would never tolerate in their own country. But actually, when I wrote my Brexit book, probably my best book, but people can't afford to read it, so.
Well, that's the problem right there, isn't it?
Exactly, so that's probably why I suggested two other books for people to read. They're not as good as a Brexit book, but like I said, Brexit book sells for 120 quid, which is bloody ridiculous. But in that, you know, I mean, one of the things I make is this comparison between a need to protect our borders and to be in charge of our borders, which the European Union will not allow us to do, so we can keep out all the people we don't want to be in this country, which we're really not honest, are people with darker skin, against a nation that made itself great by doing the very thing that it finds objectionable to other people. And these other people are not coming to conquer. They're coming simply often not to do the jobs that most of us don't want to do. Yet my mother remembers what it was like to be a maid in the house of an expatriate white family. And you think about the language, that white people get to be expatriates, but black and brown people have to get to be immigrants.
Yeah.
That's the nature of why colour symbolism matters. Because
the language of superiority already, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. The language of superiority and power.
And we are a good thing, which is an expatriate, bringing nothing but goodness to that other country. Nothing but benefits.
Absolutely. I mean, I still remember in the weeks running up to the referendum, being on the train going to Manchester. At the time I was working in Manchester, and there's a group of white lads in front of me, and they were travelling up like to go to one of the football matches, either Man City or Man United, and they're all white and they're all talking about Brexit. And the interesting was, like, so there was a group of 5 of them, and 4 of them were all clearly for Brexit. It should happen. We need to maintain our borders. The one voice of dissent was one of them in the group who said, well, he said, I'm uncomfortable with all of this conversation. He said, my parents live in Spain. They retired there about 15, 20 years ago. They live in a small English group, commune, just off the Costa del Sol. They don't speak a word of Spanish. They don't integrate. They have no intention of integrating that. They go to English shops. They work with, they're part of this group. They're proud of being British. And somehow that's perfectly okay, says. But what if Asian people or Muslims did that in this country? How would we feel? And what would be the reaction of the Daily Mail, he said. And his friends kind of were quiet for a moment, and then they changed the subject, and I thought, that's a really interesting point, and it's good that at least one individual in that group was able to see the disparity and the hypocrisy of that.
And that's the power of being, you know, speaking sometimes for people that are not you as well, isn't it? Like you said before, you know, sometimes you put yourself more at risk if you speak all the time about your own self, you know, if it's always the women speaking up for women, or Black people speaking up for Black people. But the power of a white man who doesn't need to, and I'm not saying he's some kind of hero because he doesn't get a cookie, but he's more capable and able to do that because it's less risk for him. So, yeah. Okay, so moving on. Thank you, Anthony. So some questions from Twitter. So we've got how do white people learn to challenge ourselves to become more honest about stereotypes and prejudices we still hold?
Yeah. I think that one of the things that as Black people we've always had to do is that we've always been aware of what it is to be Black in the world. That's something that it just comes to us. Even the thing about even the thing about some of my friends and colleagues who would say, I try to work in a colorblind world, I try not to think about it. It's something that they know that they're doing, they're actively trying not to think about something. Therefore, one of the things I've often said in some of my work is that one of the things that white people can do is to begin to deconstruct themselves in a way which Black people have always done. So a simple exercise, which I will describe for free, although it is in Is God Colorblind, which obviously I'm encouraging people to go out and buy when it comes out in a few weeks' time at a much more acceptable price of something less than £20. Also respect the Brexit book, which is £120. Is that it's an exercise where I tell people in the book it's obviously drawn, but if you don't want to buy the book, that's fine. So you get a series of concentric circles. And in the innermost circle, I say, put down one, at most two, but no more than two, descriptors of yourself. Anything you want, just any way in which you want to describe yourself. And in that innermost circle, the two terms that you think are the most important at that particular moment in your in time. In the next circle out, then put down another 3 or 4 descriptors of yourself that are important, but not as important as the one in the innermost circle. And then do that for the 5 or 6 circles that they are. Then when you've done that, then look at what you have put down and where you put it. And then interpret why you put things in particular places. So one of the quick generalizations I often find is in this exercise, that the more normative or accepted a particular thing is the least likely we are to name it. And if we do name it, then we may not necessarily give it any significance because we don't have to. So for example, in terms of exercise, men tend not to put down any term linked to masculinity or maleness, but women tend to do so. Able-bodied people will always put down something pretty similar at the center, but if you're able-bodied, hardly anyone ever puts down able-bodied. Certainly I've done this a number of times, and what's always interesting is the issue of sexuality, particularly doing it in church groups, because obviously some people are out and some are not. And some are kind of out, so it's innermost circle. That's how I define myself in a political statement. I'm a gay man or I'm a lesbian woman. Other people will say, well, I put it down, but I kind of maybe put it a bit further out because it's significant, but I'm not sure it's as significant as the person who wants to see it in more political terms. Interesting enough, hardly anyone puts down I'm heterosexual. Hardly ever puts that down because it's so normative that actually you don't feel the need to name it. People who are Black will put that down. People who are white, usually, if they do, it's not near the center. I still remember a classic moment where I had an argument with, thankfully, it's not the same person, so I can, well, actually, I don't care, so I'll name names anyway. So I did a workshop with Chester Diocese about 15 years ago, maybe a bit longer than that. And I did this exercise. At that point, it was kind of in development to go into the book, so I did the exercise. And at the time, women could not become bishops. That's the important thing to remember. So anyway, so everyone's there, including the bishop. And then, of course, I then said to people, and in the book I say, I'm not going to criticize you for what you have put down or not put down, because it's your choice. That's the thing about being a human being. We make that choice. However, I think it's right that I might ask you why you put it down, which is not to indict you, but just to be reflective of why certain things are named or not named. So this bishop didn't put down male any place. So I asked him, why not? He said, oh, yeah, but it doesn't matter. Sitting there in his purple shirt. And I thought, seriously? So I thought, okay, let me give him a chance to sort of put his foot out of his mouth here before I perhaps embarrass him. I mean, obviously that's one of the things about not being ordained in any church and not being Anglican, is that you can't do sod all to me anyway. So anyway, so I said, seriously, are you seriously telling me that being male has no significance for you whatsoever? I said, I'm not saying that you should put it down, but I'm just asking you why you have it, and you're telling me it has no significance. It says none whatsoever. And I said, really? So I kind of stood back and told every woman to stand up in the room. And I said, you know what? I said, all these women many of them have many gifts and graces, but let's be perfectly honest with you. They'll be born with the wrong tackle, therefore are automatically ruled out of being a bishop. And you're telling me that the accident of birth that allows you to hold them up, is that no one else in this room has no significance. And obviously, he got very, very upset and agitated because I was being disrespectful. I said, no. I said, you know, Smart, I said, if you're upset, then quite frankly, you've upset yourself, because a more gracious response could have easily ended this. That if you had said, you know, Smith, wow, I haven't put down male or masculinity. I wonder why that is. That's fine, because all I'm simply asking you to do is just to be reflective. But you're the one who then wanted to be dismissive and said it doesn't matter, when clearly it does matter, because you could have 10,001 gifts and graces, but in 2005, when we did this, if you put it bluntly, if you weren't born with a penis, then quite frankly, you could not be a bishop, irrespective of what else you may have had going for you. And you're telling me it has no significance. In the same way that if someone says, well, actually, I look at this and I put down whiteness, I'm not going to attack them, because again, like I said, it's a personal thing. But I will ask the question, why haven't you?
Yeah. And this is why the whole colour blindness is also racist, really, in the end. Because if you say you're colourblind, it's because you're probably white, and you can afford to be colourblind, because for you, white is insignificant, but that's because you get everything you want. Whereas you're forced to think of it if you're not white. So
absolutely, yeah. So I think what white people can do is to buy my book. No, I'm joking. I'll say I'm people.
No, I would second that.
Thank you. Okay, well, so Ruth said you shouldn't buy it, so that's all right then. Is that exciting, or anything that just gets you to be reflective of yourself, and particularly like to challenge the things that you take for granted, the things that give you some type of entitlement and privilege that is not earned. That's not to be embarrassed about or to be ashamed about. It's just to acknowledge. Also, in that case, then, what power then can you have then, like, to be an ally for someone else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think really that answers the next one as well, which is, how can white people learn to be helpful, humble allies? I think you've really answered that one, haven't you? Yeah. Then we've got an interesting one, which is, what do we need to get onto the theological curricula? Is the answer your book again?
Of course. Of course, that's it. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the perennial problems that we've always had, and it's better than it used to be, but it's still nowhere near as good as it should be, is that we've taught people like to deconstruct biblical texts. We taught people like to deconstruct ideas. What we have not done is taught people like to deconstruct notions of identity and selfhood. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we still have this thing whereby we still pretend that there's such a thing called Christian theology without any qualifier. All theology is some type of theology. Every theologian is some type of theologian. The notion that, oh, I'm just a theologian. Well, no. So what kind of theologian are you? Because actually, we know that social location, class, all these isms that we talk about, that impacts upon how we do theology. James Cone has this wonderful quote. He says, theology is human speech about God. God does not do theology. We do theology. And our theology is not God. Our theology is our best attempt to talk about God. But the notion that that can be done in some neutral, objective fashion is a fallacy. It is a quintessential conceit of whiteness. Yeah. Therefore, what often happens is that Christian theology often distracts us. So, as I said, so like that example of that type of abstract philosophizing. I remember reading a book many years ago, and I shouldn't name the scholar because he's not here to defend himself, so I won't. But it's a white systematic theologian who was writing about difference. And what he does is, he's a systematic theologian, so he looks at Jesus and says, well, Jesus has his different identities. So Jesus is human identity plus his identity that makes him one with the Godhead. And he uses terms like hypostasis and homos and his sense of his being and his human identity. These are ways of theorizing around difference. And I thought, what a way to talk about difference and have to avoid talk about whiteness. I talk about the nature of white supremacy in the world. I mean, it's no wonder that James Cone, that one of his great articles is Theology's Original Sin, silence in the face of white supremacy. So this guy goes to all this intellectual energy in order to talk about difference and can do so without ever having to talk about people. And let's face it, it is the physical difference of people that is often the one that scars our humanity. So, for example, even thinking about immigration, one of the things I remember, my mother telling me about when she first came to Britain, and she said, Anthony, I came to Britain from Jamaica, knowing everything about Britain because that's how I've been taught, and yet the British didn't know the first thing about me because they had never assumed that these colonial subjects would ever turn up in Britain. Because when they passed the 1948 Commonwealth Nationality Act, all the stuff now that comes out of the Home Office shows that what they expected were white people from the white settler colonies to come back. So essentially, it was people from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and white South Africans they thought would want to come back to the mother country and help rebuild it. It never occurred to them that Black and Asian people actually might turn up because they were colonial subjects. Because even our language, there was the old Commonwealth, i.e. like the white settler countries, which I think it's true to say that Queen Elizabeth was the first one to go visit them. Up to that point, all the monarchs, if they went abroad, they went to the white ones, because of course, actually, visiting the black and brown people actually wasn't even worth doing so. How then you can write an essay about difference and never mention people, when actually last time I checked, actually, no one got killed because we understood whether Jesus' one bit of identity versus other bit of identity was so polarized or so significant that might mean I might kill you, but we might and probably would kill you if you got the wrong color skin, but yet somehow this guy didn't want to talk about that. Therefore, I think in our curricula, we need theological tools that will help us to wrestle with what has been the deep-seated anguish in humanity that says that we cannot see our neighbour and love our neighbour as ourselves if that neighbour is seen as the other. That's been our perennial problem with humanity, and too little has been written about that, certainly by white theologians.
And I would add as well that we need to, in theological curriculums and in theological schools, stop just allowing people like John Milbank and his recent tweet to go unchallenged by the theological establishment, because to kind of, what did he say? That basically all liberation theologies were elitist rubbish. and yet he can't unpack his own whiteness or see that he's also working from a contextual position, and that doesn't, you know, that kind of thing shouldn't go unchallenged anymore.
Absolutely not, because I think there's two things really going on there. I mean, one obviously is a casual dismissal of theologies that have qualifiers, when of course his theology is a qualifier. You know, I mean, his notion of radical orthodoxy is just white neoconservative theology.
Yeah.
There may well be black people actually doing neo-orthodoxy, but I've never come across them. You know, so firstly is that all theology is contextual, and whether he wants to acknowledge that or not, so is his theology. The truth is that because theology is human speech about God, our God talk tells us more about us than it does about God. Mm. All our God talk tells us about our human condition, and even the questions we ask, of all the questions you can ask, what you choose to ask and how you choose to do it says something about who we are as the authors of it. But secondly, is this notion that somehow that even people doing theologies from their particular perspectives and are not in dialogue with the mainstream work, however you define it. So James Cone is not just a great black theologian, James Cone is a great systematic theologian. I defy anyone like to study systematic theology in the 20th century and not look at James Cone. I defy anyone like to do ethics and not look at Emily Tarrant. I defy anyone like to do theology and in terms of practical theology and not look at someone like Emmanuel Larty. That in each context, they're right from a particular perspective, but what they're also doing is talking back to the central hegemony and redefining what that particular practice is. That's what's always gone on. So therefore, like for someone who's supposed to be so intelligent, that by my grandmother actually would talk about intellectual fools. Yeah. And said theologian, I think, comes into that category. Absolutely. He has marked himself off as being one of the quintessential intellectual fools.
Yeah. Very true. Right, just to finish, because we better finish up. I've kept you for an hour and a half now. Just to finish up, do you have any more books or podcasts or anything you think that people should be listening to or could be listening to? Would help?
Yeah, okay, so a podcast and a book. So podcast, if you'll pardon my arrogance. So a few weeks ago, I did like the Nomcast podcast.
Nomad, is it? Nomad, that one?
Nomad. Nomcast. Nomad podcast. And in that, I was talking a lot about white supremacy and the Black Lives Matter and put it into a broader historical context. I think that is certainly worth listening to, because I think it gives some accessible tools around how we sort of deconstruct whiteness. So, for example, one of the key things I talk about that is that in Britain, we know the significance of white flight, both in terms of economic and social space, but also in terms of church space. Actually, when churches become too multicultural, too diverse, many white people leave, and there's a history around that, around how whiteness is about colonization and creating exclusive space. It's why during the era of colonialism, even into post-war Britain, post-Second World War Britain, there was always this anxiety around purity, and therefore fears of contamination, because that comes back to white fragility. So that's worth listening to. In terms of books, I think one of the best books of the last 10 years is by a friend of mine in America called Willie James Jennings, and the book is called The Christian Imagination. It's won a sweep of awards. Fantastic book.
I've come across it in my studies, yeah.
Yeah, and what Jennings does is he looks at the way in which whiteness, fragility, and colonialism embedded themselves into Christianity that have distorted it ever since. Which then explains why, even in the context of Brexit, on the context of Donald Trump, you have the politics of xenophobia and exclusion supported by genuinely decent white Christians, because what they have not understood is how white supremacy has so inveigled itself into their faith that actually what is their operative way of talking about their faith is not a liberative Jesus of colour who stands alongside people at the margins, but it's a Jesus of white exceptionalism that is about propping up their own anxiety.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a
they
fantastic.
haven't separated whiteness from Christianity. Yeah.
No.
Great, that's brilliant. So Willie, what was it? Willie Jennings, isn't it?
James Jennings, yeah.
Willie James Jennings.
Jennings.
Imagination, the Christian imagination.
Yeah, Christian imagination.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, and obviously all of your books, we definitely.
I know obviously all of my books, probably with the exception of the Brexit one.
I've got that one actually, but that's because I have a special loan from the government for my studies, for my MA studies, and I could get a few books, you see, so can justify a bit of expense occasionally. And I thought it was very good. Thank you so much for being with us, Anthony, and we're really looking forward to having everyone else on that you've recommended. So thank you very much.
It's been a genuine pleasure.